Okay, let's get going on the HDR tutorials again. So, the tutorial of your choice has to be in Blackboard before the end of class. There's a Dropbox for it if you haven't already done so. The 3 edited pictures that were in last week's Dropbox you are going to have until noon if they're not done. I meant to have that if the deadline is different. I meant to allow you work time in class if you needed it. And then now we're going to practice 2 or 3 more versions of HDRs, and then I'm going to give you the rest of the time to make your HDR and make your pano. So the pano process, you should know, we practiced that last week in class. But for HDR, we're going to make, last week in class we did the realistic looking version, and we used it, we made it a 32-bit HDR, and there were very few windows to deal with, and we were done. The next one we're going to do is on page 170, if you're in the book. We're going to do the tone mapped look, which is a very extreme look. So the 3 images in Bridge, navigate to the Chapter 6 folder. So that would be in last week's, if you downloaded them last week. So the Chapter 6 folder, we are going to select in Bridge, Tone Map 1, Tone Map 2, and Tone Map 3. So with those 3 selected in Bridge, notice that one of them looks normal, one's really bright, one's really dark. So these are the 3 extremes. From there, we're going to go to the Tools menu, and we're going to go down to Photoshop, which I now have. Remember last week I didn't? And we're going to choose Merge to HDR Pro. So Tools, Photoshop, Merge to HDR Pro. Keep on going. Yep, Chapter 6. Say that again? Yep, do you have all 3 selected in Bridge? And then do Tools up at the top menu, Photoshop, done, and then Merge to HDR. Yep. It's going to take a little bit. Eventually, it's going to pop up a picture that looks like this, and we're going to have to do some tweaking and changing. So I'll wait till everybody gets to this screen. Notice down at the bottom are the 3 originals. Exposure value they did was regular, +2 and -2. So those are some pretty big extremes. And hopefully, if you were bracketing, you did those big extremes too. +1/3, +2/3 doesn't really cut it when you really want to get this funky HDR. So from here, let's go. The first thing that we have to do is, we're still in 32-bit from that last demo we did. We need to change that to 16-bit, and we get a lot more options and sliders. It's not very good still, but that's the way it is. So there are some presets up here at the top. There's a preset button, the very first thing, and you can click the down arrow. And you can scroll through some of these different presets to see how they look. You may like one. You may be happy to be done at the end of this. Scott Kelby himself made a preset, and Adobe liked it so much that they actually put it in here, and it's called Scott number 5. That's the one that we're going to use. Right, thank you for the reaction. He did all these, he filled around with all these, and then when he was done, he saved it as a preset. Also, a guy who works for him is RC Concepcion is his name, and this is RC number 5. He made one also. That's his. It doesn't have the same look, but this one's way more photorealistic. But the one that's called Scott 5 is the one that we're going to work off of. This is funky HDR, right? This is a cool, like this, you know something's going on here. This does not happen with a normal picture. All right. Let's go up. If you have the Scott 5 preset turned on, at the top we have some information. The first one is Edge Glow, After the radius and the strength, we're going to click on the edge smoothness. So turn that on. Takes a lot of the harshness out of the effect. If you want a little extra juice, we're going to drag the strength slider to the right. So you can still tweak. After you've gone with a preset, you can continue to crank up or down, and you can take it too far, obviously. We're going to take it to a +6, 7, just so we're all on the same page. All right, with this preset that Scott Kelby made, he said there's really only 2 sliders that he ever needs to tweak depending on the picture, and they're fairly simple. The shadow slider and the highlight slider. So we're going to look at these different options, and we're going to go down, let's see, 763, 300, those are all the same. We're going to go down here to the Advanced tab, and in the shadow, if we wanted to tweak it, we can pull it to the right and see how it behaves. You may or may not like it. It's affecting the details in the shadows. We're going to leave it at -100. The highlights, however, we're going to bump up a little bit. I'm going to make them brighter. We're going to pull the highlights to a -40. And the last 2 we're going to leave. So the highlights and the shadows, using this preset, these are the 2 that you'd probably want to play around with until you get the effect that you personally want. Just so that we're all following the same directions in the book. It's not that these are right for every image, but for this one, let's go with these 2 numbers. All right. At this point, we're going to say, OK. We're going to process the HDR. So at the bottom right, we're still in an HDR window. We're going to hit OK. We're not done tweaking it, but we're going to go ahead and let it process it as an HDR and then bring it back in Photoshop. So when it's done, we have our image open in Photoshop, and it's a background layer, and it's ready for us to do anything we would want to. So again, this is a JPEG image, and all the Camera Raw things that we could do, remember how we can force it open in Camera Raw? But the cool thing is, from within Photoshop, we can non-destructively apply and use all of those Camera Raw filters by using, applying it as a filter. So we're going to go up to the filter menu, and we're going to choose Camera Raw Filter. And that's going to push this open in Adobe Camera Raw, which is this new floating window. Here's all the things we're used to seeing. And if we want to tweak it, this is where we're going to play with it. So one thing that we're going to do is we're going to take the exposure slider and we're going to bump it up to 0.7. So we're going to brighten it up a little bit. For an HDR, a wonky HDR like this one, to be what we expect, we're going to bump up the contrast also. +37 on the contrast. The lights are very bright up at the top part of the image, so we're going to pull down the highlights a little bit. So the highlights we're going to pull back to a -60. And the shadow slider, we're going to pull the other direction to a +70. Before we say OK, do you guys see anything going on when you look at the image that looks weird? Look at the floor and look at that top beam. Anything look weird? How about the shape of this top beam? A little arch, don't you think? And how about the floor? A little bowed, maybe? Yeah. So there's some lens distortion in this, and that's also something that we can fix in Camera Raw. So as long as we're here, we're going to work on that. The lens correction icon is at the top where all those icons are. It's the one to the left of the FX, and it says lens correction if you hover on it. So click on that to bring up your different lens correction options. And let's see if this is different. It is slightly different than it used to be. Let's take our distortion. Pull that to the right, pull it to the left. Which way is improving it? To the right? Yep, I think it's definitely leveling out if we pull to the right. All right. From there, some of the things they're talking about don't exist in this anymore. So we're going to say OK. And when we're back in Photoshop, if we look at our whole image, we now have some dead space, right? Some white areas. So we're just probably easiest just to crop and to crop out those spots. We did a better job of improving. There's still a little bit of distortion though, to be honest. But we improved it that way. And we now have a pretty decent HDR. There's some finishing steps that we like to do to every HDR when we're done. So we're going to save this as a different name. So do a File, Save As, and call this one Stairs. It can stay as a PSD, that's fine. And just save it wherever you're working right now. I guess I'm going to save mine in Images. And we'll come back to that. Leave that tab open. We're going to come back to it after we do a couple more tutorials, and we're going to learn the finishing steps and then apply them again. So that's one version of an HDR. Another one that we're going to look at, is everybody done with that one, I hope? Okay. Go back to Bridge. And the next one that we're going to work with is the third one, Blended. And there are 3 different images that we're going to do. So we're going to get the best of both worlds, where we're going to take an HDR version and kind of a regular version, and we're going to mix the 2 of them so it's not so extreme. So shift-click to select all 3 of the number 3 blended images, 1, 2, 3. And then choose again Tools, Photoshop, Merge to HDR Pro, and let it run that merging process with this one. Three of them. And when it's done, it's going to pop open in Merge to HDR Pro, and it's just going to have that original application done to it. And you could roll through the presets to look at some ideas that you might like, or do everything custom. But we're ultimately going to choose the Scott 5 preset again. And we're going to turn on, look at how glowy this got when I turn that on, but look at how much detail you see in the wood floor and in the bright ceiling. Click on that edge smoothness again to kind of knock down some of that weird glow, the harsh edges. So Scott 5 and edge smoothness on. That's where we want to be on this next step. And then the HDR version that we're going to make to play with this, we want it to be super dramatic. So we're going to do a lot of tweaking. So over here on the right-hand side in our tone and detail, all of these options, tone and detail we're going to leave alone. But we are going to go down to shadows, highlights, all this area. Shadows, we're going to pull all the way to the right, plus 100. Highlights, we're going to pull to a negative 57. Somewhere in there. And the other 2 we're going to leave as is. So 100 and negative 57-ish are those 2 tweaks there. And then we're going to say OK. And that's going to apply it and open it in Photoshop. Okay, at this point, we're going to go back into Bridge, and we're going to open up the regular exposure, the one that's the most natural. So that's this blended number 2. We're going to double click on that to also open that in Photoshop. If it pops into Camera Raw, like mine just did, just tell it to open it. Yeah, I just want to make sure we didn't have to reset anything. To open it, and that's going to bring it into Photoshop. So right now I have This is the best normal version that we had, and then this other window is our HDR version. So these are the two that we're going to be working with. All right, from here, we have two images in Photoshop, and we want to select, which one are we doing? The regular one. So make sure that the regular one is the one that's open. Do a Command A to put your marching ants around all of it, and then do a Command C to copy it, so it's in our memory. Switch over to the other tab, the window of the Extreme HDR version that we did, and do a Command V. And that's going to plop that other one, it's going to paste it right on top of the funky one. So we have two layers, normal exposure, and then the one underneath it is the Extreme HDR funky one that we made. And that's exactly what we're going to fix next. Yep, they are not exactly lined up. If you handheld your shots, there's a chance that they are not perfectly going to align. So shift-click in the Layers panel to select both layers. Make sure they both are gray so that you have them both selected in the Layers panel. Then go under the Edit menu and choose Auto Align Layers, which is about halfway down. And then you get, how do you want to go about doing this? The Auto Radio button is selected, or actually Perspective is selected. Make sure that the Auto is the one that's selected, so pick that first option in the Auto Align part and say OK. Now what it's going to do is it's going to stack that top one. It's going to tweak it a little if it needs to so that it's perfectly stacked on what's below. So now that they're aligned, we probably need to crop them just a little. There might be a little bit of that one got bent, so do you see how there's a little bit of transparency showing around the edges? So let's take our crop tool and just crop it down a smidge on all four sides to get rid of that dead area, if you have it. So at this point, we have two perfectly aligned photos on top of each other. And if you turn the visibility of the top layer on and off, you can see that. And I also see that I need to crop it a little bit more on the left, on my right, I mean. Didn't quite work. There. Okay. Go back and click on your top layer to make that one the active layer. That's the one that looks like the regular picture. They're perfectly aligned. What we now need to do is blend the way the two interact. First thing we're going to do is the opacity. So pull the opacity of that regular photo layer down to about 65%. And with that, you start to see that really funky HDR coming through just a little bit. So it's a perfect mix. And with your opacity alone, you can change how much of the funky one shows through, and you can get it to look exactly how you like. It's not an extreme HDR, but it's definitely a good blend of both. If you're happy with the way you have your blend, like I have mine at 65% opacity, we're all good with that. We want to flatten this into one layer so that we can tweak it further. So from the Layers panel, you can choose Merge Down or Merge Visible. It doesn't matter. They're exactly the same thing. So Command E is going to merge layer 1 down onto layer 2, and it's just going to be a single photograph now, single layer. And if we want to do any more tweaking, the cool thing is we can force it into the Camera Raw filters again just by going up to Filter and choosing Camera Raw filter, and we can tweak this JPEG and change it just a little bit to improve it. So we're going to increase the contrast, so bump that up to 28. So we still want it to look cool. Bump up the shadows to a plus 40. So you're opening up detail in the shadows. The clarity slider, we're going to bump this to plus 15. Or whatever. And then another cool thing that we can do is adding this vignette where it darkens the edges. That lives in the FX tab. So of all those little icons at the top, click on the FX. The post-crop vignetting, if you pull the slider to the left, it starts darkening your edges. If you go to the right, it adds a white vignette around your edges. So this is a cool feature. You can force any, or you can add this filter to any picture, like your portrait. Sometimes it's kind of cool to add this vignetting around the edges. So add a little bit of a black vignette and then say okay. And when you get your picture back in Photoshop, you can see how your edges are a little bit darkened, which is a pretty cool thing. All right, this one that we just did, let's do a File, Save As. Yep. Not opening, you do a filter, Camera Raw filters. You don't force it open in Camera Raw, you just apply it as a filter. Name this one Library PSD, and just leave it open also. And then this number 3 blended, we can close that third tab that you have open. We don't need that one anymore. We can close that out, and we don't need to save it. And the last tutorial that we're going to work through is one that is probably going to come in handy for a lot of you, because it's, what if I didn't bracket or I can't bracket? How do I get this effect from one single shot? Can you? Yes, you can. And there's a couple of ways of doing it. So let's go into Bridge. I'm not trying to export anything. And from Bridge, I want you to open number 4, single 1. Double click on that. It's a raw file. And one way that you can do it is just taking this one image and tweaking a few things. We're going to take the shadows, we're going to open them all the way up to +100. Notice how all the shadows got bright. We're going to take the highlights, we're going to pull them all the way down to -100. And then the clarity, we're going to max that one out too at +100. And then from there, to really give it that HDR look, we can do the FX tab again and add that dark vignetting around the edges a little bit. And click Open Image. And by cranking clarity, highlights, shadows, you made a quick, down and dirty HDR out of a single exposure. That's one way. That's the quick, fast. And maybe there's enough detail and drama in your picture that that's the easiest way to go. If not, there are other ways. And let's go back into Bridge. I want to find a totally different option here. People don't look good in HDR, by the way. Just to show you that we can do this on a different photo, another way, I want you to go into Chapter 8 Pictures and open up the one Web Cobble number 2. But wait, there's more. We're not going to open it in Photoshop. We're going to force it open in Camera Raw. So from Bridge, with it selected, we have to do a Command R, and that's going to force it into Camera Raw. So presumably the one that we have is our good medium exposure. This is the one that we're happy with. So what we need to do is make a dark version of it, as if we were there making that one. So in your exposure slider, pull it down to a -2, as if you took the picture 2 stops too dark. That's the only one you're tweaking. Exposure, -2. And say, open this image. In Photoshop, I want you to do a File, Save As, and call it Cafe Dark.jpg. Because this is the dark version of it that we just made, we're going to name it as a JPEG. And click Save. Then, any guess what we're going to do? Go back into Bridge, force it open in Camera Raw again, and make a +2 exposure, the bright version of it. Open it up, save it as Cafe Bright. +2. Because that's where the picture was last time you used it. So it comes back to that same setting. So Cafe Bright. And then your final step would be to open it one more time in Camera Raw. And up at the top right, where you have the 4 lines, you're going to click on that and say, take it back to the Camera Raw defaults. That's where it started. That's the regular version. If there's anything you needed to change, you could do it now. But for the most part, this is the middle of the road perfect shot. So we're going to just open this one. And I'm going to call this one File Save As Cafe Normal. So now, using Camera Raw, I built a dark version and a bright version, just like I would have in camera if I could have bracketed those. So I made a normal, a bright, and a dark. So if we go back to Bridge, somewhere in Bridge we have these 3 images: Cafe Bright, Cafe Dark, Cafe Normal. So from one shot that they took on their camera, we created the other 2 extremes, and we can do our usual process of Tools, Photoshop, Merge to HDR Pro. And from there we could tweak it however we wanted, but from one single starting exposure, using the magic of Camera Raw, we can create the dark version and the bright version.
This is what it gave me.
If you get this manually set EV thing, click Cancel.
No, it's the merge to Did you do the merge stage?
I didn't even turn on like that.
Do your step 5 instead of the one that it kicks out first, or do something else.
Oh, I didn't do stop 5. That's probably fine.
Oh, great. Try it a different.
Cool.
Well, and it depends. You remember that one I showed you in the PowerPoint, that cafe scene where people were sitting up front? You're like, that's a picture? Like, it almost looked like a goofy painting. You know, you might have severe, but in general, you can do this. So if you only took a single exposure, you can either do the first version that I showed you, or you can do this version where you open all 3. All right, let's learn these finishing techniques so we can be done and you guys can work. The one that we're going to look at first is high pass sharpening for HDR images. So back in Bridge, we're going to start with a new photo completely. We're in chapter 6. I got to get back to chapter 6. And the image that we want to use is number 6, high pass JPEG. They've already made it into an HDR for us. So this is the finished HDR that we want. So we're just going to open it in Photoshop. And we're going to take a look at it. It's obviously pretty funky and HDR'd. We're going to right away make a duplicate of this layer so that we're working non-destructively. So Command J to make a duplicate. And then on that duplicate layer, we're going to go to the Filter menu. We're going to choose Other, and then we're going to choose High Pass. And this is what it's going to give you. What we need to do is drag this radius slider at the bottom all the way to the left so that everything turns gray, flat gray. Now what we need to do is slowly move to the right until we can just start to see the color peek through. For him, he said it started to happen at about 9 pixels. So we're pulling to the right until we can see the color start to peek through. What this is doing is really identifying the edges, and it's going to help with the sharpening process. So from here, we're going to say, okay, now we have this high pass, weird gray layer on top of our picture. We're going to go to the top of the layers panel, and we're going to change the blending mode of this top layer from normal to one of these 3, and we're going to see which we like. It can either be soft, overlay, or hard light. So go through them and notice how it's sharpening the photo to your liking. Do you like overlay, soft light, or hard light? Pick one of them that you like, and then if it's too much, you can always back off the opacity of that sharpening layer. So you can pull the opacity down. And then if for any reason you liked the way this was sharpening the building, but you didn't like what it did to the sky, see how the sky got really grainy with all that sharpening? We could very easily mask this out. So to do that, we're going to press and hold the Option key and click on the Add Layer Mask button, and that's going to put a black mask on that layer. It's going to cover up everything we just did. And now what we need to do is we want to paint with white over the parts that you want to be super sharp. So with your paintbrush and white, you would paint over, presumably, the building and this rocky foreground area. You're going to avoid the sky. It does not need to be super sharp. So you're just painting your white mask where the building is here in the middle. And that way that super sharpening is only happening. Again, if you aren't happy with the blend mode, you can see if another one would be better, if overlay, soft light, or hard light is best for you. So this high pass sharpening is one finishing touch that we often will do, but the next step that I'm going to show you is a very typical finishing. So if you have something that you've made into an HDR and it would benefit from this extra sharpness that we just did, consider doing this step in the book when you're done. Open the JPEG and do this step. The final version that I'm going to share with you for ending techniques, back in Bridge, Finishing Moves JPEG. We're going to open that in Photoshop. You can tell that this is an HDR photo because we would not get the detail in the brights up here and the details in the shadows in one single exposure. This just would not happen in the real world. So this has definitely already been processed in HDR. And the finishing techniques that we're going to do are we're going to give it a vignette, which is those dark edges. We're going to sharpen it and give it a soft glow, kind of like we did with that landscape picture of his. It's like his magic sauce for finishing them in a really cool way. So from here, go up to the Filter drop-down menu and choose Camera Raw Filter. It's going to open it in Camera Raw, give us all of our options that we have. All right, the vignetting that we're going to do, we're going to click on the FX button again, and in post-crop vignetting, we're going to pull this to the left a little bit so we kind of darken up our edges. That's going to be the first thing we do. Maybe a -20-ish, somewhere in there, so it just kind of darkens up the edges. That vignetting is super easy to do in Camera Raw, so just apply it as a Camera Raw filter, and you can add that cool vignetting to your pictures really quickly. Say OK, so we're back into Photoshop with it. And from Photoshop, we're going to do a couple of steps. We're going to sharpen it extremely. We can use the high pass sharpening technique that we just learned on that brick one. We could do that, or we can do unsharp mask and do it a lot dramatically to really make it pop. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to do Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask, and then we are going to sharpen the daylights out of it, as he says. So we're going to do an amount of 90%. And again, your preview, remember if you hold down your mouse and then let go inside this preview window, you see the before and after. I'm looking at this couch in the foreground, and when I see how it's sharpened, it's like the detail in it is a lot clearer, the edges are clearer. Radius, we're going to do a 1.5 pixels, and threshold, we're going to take down to 0. So 90%, 1.5, and again, you'd be doing this by just looking at it, not plugging in exact numbers. And we're going to say OK. So now we have a super sharp version of this picture with that vignetting around the edge. Now what we want to do is make a copy of this, so Command J. So we have a sharp copy on top of a sharp original. And we're going to blur this one. So we're going to do Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. just like we did with that landscape scene. And we're going to do 50 pixels. Isn't it? Kind of makes you wonder why. It's just a bunch of blobs of light, right? And say, okay, two things we have to do. We have to change the opacity and the blend mode of this. So first thing we're going to do is pull down the opacity 70%, and you can definitely see that hazy look. And then we need to change our blend mode, and we're going to switch over to soft light instead. So without that, and with it, you can turn that on and off and see the difference. So that blending, the soft light, the lowered opacity, having a really sharp copy, and then putting that blur on it really gives you a cool finished product. So those 3 steps, vignette, sharp, and glow, are good finishing steps to any HDR. So I'd like you to pick one that we already did, whether it's stairs or library. Do one of those two, either the stairs or the library, and do these, actually do the stairs, because that one doesn't have a vignette on it. We already did a vignette on the other one. So the finishing steps on this one would be filter, camera raw filter, add the vignette, so go into the FX and add that darkening of the edges to suit you, and say, okay, bring it back to Photoshop. Then we would sharpen it up, so we would do filter, sharpen, unsharp mask, and we're going to go with those default settings that we had of 90, 1.5, and 0. That's really going to sharpen it up. Then we're going to duplicate that layer, Command J, and on this layer we're going to do that weird blurring. So we're going to do filter, blur, Gaussian blur, 50 pixels, maybe more, make it really blobs of color. Say OK, and then you have to drop the opacity and the blend mode to make this work. So start dropping your opacity a little bit, and then switch the blend mode of that layer to be soft light instead. And you can decide if you need to play with the opacity more or not. So those are the finishing touches that really make any HDR work. So your homework and in-class work right now is, I'm going to go to Bridge to make sure we're clear on this. In today's learning plan, I have a drop box for your panorama that you need to stitch together following last week's directions. And I have a drop box for your HDR that you can now make based on what you've learned today. They need to be resized to 72 dots per inch, max dimension of 10 inches. I don't want huge files. In the message box, you have to tell me this information. I'm going to hand back papers again. You guys, again, lost a lot of points because you didn't answer stuff. And that frustrates me because the pictures are good and the directions are pretty clear. Answer the 3 questions to get your points, or the 3 topics. So make sure in the message box in Blackboard you answer these 2 things. Then remember, if you haven't done it already in last week's learning plan, in Learning Plan 5 and 6 from last week is where you'll find the drop boxes for the 3 edited photos. Your edited portrait, environmental, and landscape. So the shots that you've taken throughout this year that you've submitted to me, you're going to do editing to those and get those in these 3 drop boxes. And then just a final reminder of 2 things. One's quite important. As a reminder, in Learning Plan 7, remember we talked about Flickr today? Tell me who you are in Flickr so I can add you to a group. And over the course of a week, you need to get 4 pictures in Flickr, and you need to comment on 2 of your classmates. If you need to wait and do the commenting next week in class, that's fine. But get your pictures uploaded to Flickr. Now, really important because next week is the end. So what's your final project, right? Here it is, in Learning Plan 7, right here, your final project. Let's do it at the end of class next week. You need to give me your 3 best shots, period, in these categories. Your absolutely best people photo, I need to see the original straight out of your camera. The only change to that is that you're gonna resize it to make it 72 DPI, 10 inches. But it's the original. Whatever's in the frame shows up, no anything. Then you need to give me an edited PSD of how you make that an awesome shot. So your very best people photo, your very best landscape photo, facility, like it's a building or something. So people, building, and then your very best detail shot, meaning a close-up of something. These need to be new photos. You can't pull something from 2 years ago. I can see that in your metadata. I know when the pictures existed. Has to be something you took during the course of this class.
So
Okay?
does it have to be like this week?
Not necessarily.
No.
No,
Does it have to be one that we turned in before?
no.
Okay,
It can
thank
be
you.
brand new, not one you've turned in already. So if maybe you got lucky and took some awesome shots but didn't submit them yet,
That's the one.
here's the other thing. All of these must be photorealistic. No funky editing. Do not HDR these, even though they might be perfect. Don't HDR them. Don't turn them into an oil painting. Don't use blurs and glows, and no black and white conversions either. I need to see a full color photorealistic editing job. Reason being, I've had people submit stuff turned into like a funky stained glass window to cover up the fact that it was a crap picture. I don't get it. It's photography. Give me your best pictures, right? Don't do anything funky to them. Just edit them photorealistically. Make them beautiful. Then, remember to include all the info for each shot. A caption, where and when taken. Composition principles that you used and why. Explain what you did to compose the photo. Not, it was pretty. I walked out and it was pretty, so I took it. That's not composition. Camera settings used and why. Why is again big? Yes, I'm glad, and I want you to tell me the f-stop, shutter speed, ISO, and white balance for sure. You can get that from your metadata, whether you remember it or not, you can find it out. But more importantly, how did you set up your camera and why? I put it in aperture priority mode and picked an aperture as low as it could go. It was 1.8 because I knew I wanted to blur out everything but my kitten. I needed all the focus on the kitten and everything else to blur away. The camera picked the shutter speed. I was on auto white balance because it was a normal sunny day, and auto ISO because I had no concern with bumping the ISO. I'm seeing a lot of you intentionally changing your ISO, and I don't get that unless it's a really, really dark scene, and then I'm kind of questioning why you're taking pictures in such dark scenes. If your camera's on automatic ISO and it tweaks it a little here and there, that's fine. But some of you are saying, I set my ISO to 3200, and I like to let more light in. I'm like, I don't get that. The only time you would do that would be at like 9 o'clock at night when it's almost dark. So auto ISO, you can report to me what it was, but very rarely are you changing that. So you're going to say, you're going to look at the metadata and tell me what all the settings were, and then any editing that you did to the photo and why. And again, it's going to be that generic, I fixed the exposure, I darkened the sky using the graduated filter. Maybe I did that iris lens blur. Anything you did, I just don't need to know I did 1.8 pixels here. I don't need the minutia of it. Okay? So you're going to be submitting all of these, and I want you to zip them and upload one zipped thing to Blackboard. I don't want to have to open 6 different files on all 25 of you in the class. I want to click one thing and have it all come down. Okay? So this will be due by the end of class next week, so you'll have class time to work on it. The only thing I'm going to do as a lecture next week is I'm going to share some really cool photo sites with you where you can get things made, like metallic prints, glass prints, canvases, stuff like that. And I'm going to bring in the green screen, and we're going to take pictures of each other on the green screen, and we're going to do that tutorial again to remind us how to make hair look perfect. And we're going to put each other in new and crazy places as an in-class event. The rest of it will be work time. Okay? Any questions?
Last class?
That's it. Next week. Yep.
Well, we got next week and then the week after that?
Oh,